We are creatures of desire. What we most desire is meaning. What makes us suffer most is a lack of meaning.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Marital therapist, author, and communications trainer Andrew G. Marshall invites guests from all walks of life to discuss what makes life meaningful.
Hello, I'm Andrew G. Marshall. Welcome to The Meaningful Life. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, and wherever you find your podcasts. Our society has a difficult relationship with death. We like to think it never happens except to extremely old people at the end of a long, successful, and love-filled life. But of course we know it's not true. That's why we've distanced ourselves as much as possible from death and given it over to professionals to hide the bodies from us. By contrast, our ancestors would have washed, prepared, and sat with the body. Furthermore, we've thrown a blanket of euphemisms over the whole process, like passing away, and calling the deceased our loved ones, whether they were or not. While we've updated and empowered ourselves with childbirth and the beginning of life's journeys, we still have all the Victorian trappings of the funeral and the funeral service for the end. My witness today, however, wants to change all this. He's been described as a punk rave generation undertaker who believes the family should be at the heart of the process. RU CALLENDER is the founder of the award-winning Green Funeral Company, which he started in 2000, and the author of a new book, What Remains: Life, Death, and the Human Art of Undertaking. So, Ru, how did experiencing death at the tender age of 7 prepare or not prepare you for your career as an undertaker?
Well, it's interesting, Andrew, because people still have reservations about bringing children to funerals. So I'll be doing the funeral of someone who's died of an appropriate age, in the manner that you were laying out. And I'll be talking with their grown-up children, and then at a certain point in the proceedings, their mother will go, "Well, I'm not sure about bringing the son." And I'm like, "Well, how old is he?" And they're like, "Well, he's about 8." And I say, "Did he love his grandfather? Did they have a good relationship?" And she goes, "Oh, yeah, absolutely loved him, but I'm worried that it's going to be very upsetting for him." And I say, "Well, just to let you know that if you don't bring him, there's a possibility he might turn into an undertaker. So if that's what you want for him, carry on." So, yeah, my dad was quite old when he had me. He was 57, and he'd fought in the war. He'd fought in Burma against the Japanese. And my mother was his second wife. His first wife had died in an accident. And he didn't expect to have a child. He didn't have any other children. So I was born when he was 57, and he was a retired army officer. He worked in Edinburgh Castle, and he walked out the door one day, and I watched him go, as I always did, and he never came back. And I didn't go to the funeral. My mother was sort of advised that it wasn't really necessary, and I would be upset to see her upset. So, and that sort of set a pattern for quite a run of family funerals. Both my maternal grandparents died within about 6 months of that. And then my aunt died, and there was a whole succession of funerals that I was absent from. And then when I did start to go to funerals, I just kind of found the belief system and the traditional trappings around them a bit unsatisfactory. So by the time I was 25, when my mother died, I realised that I was still not dealing with my father's death, and that it was sort of a bit like realising you're kind of in a Russian doll, in a series of Russian dolls of bereavement, and this outer one isn't actually the one you're dealing with. You're dealing with one from several years back. So it hugely prepared me, mainly by showing me what not to do, I think.
Because your parents actually lied to you. You were very concerned about your father's health, and you spoke about it, which is a very brave and a wonderful thing to do, but they lied.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel too judgmental about them for that. Yeah, I came downstairs. I'd obviously picked up on it. My sisters, my mother's 2 children from her first marriage, were much older than me. They were sort of 17 and 15 when I was born. So I was kind of an only child in some ways. And I sensed the mood in the house. And I did come downstairs in tears and came into the sitting room where my parents were and went up to my mum crying and went, "I'll tell you what's wrong, but you mustn't tell Dad." And I just said, "I don't want him to die." And she reassured me, which is the only thing to do in that situation, really. I can't imagine what it must have been like for her. She was 47 and facing the prospect of being a widow with a young child and two older children. So, yeah, but they did. They did. They both kind of reassured me, but I think that is the only thing to do in those circumstances.
But don't you think that you actually need to prepare a child a little bit better than lying to them?
Yeah, nowadays, yes. I think things are done very differently. I see a lot of children in my line of work, and we try to kind of bring them in as much as possible, even if it's just the day before the funeral, to see the coffin, so it's not such a shock when they go to this quite exciting event for most children. Grief, for children, grief is something that is in the future, and how you are with them around the death of someone sets the tone for 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So it's very important, but it can seem unimportant at the time because children are incredibly resilient, and for them it's just a kind of another day, and they keep on forgetting that the person's died or really have. I was of the age when, in theory, you're meant to completely understand death, but it's obviously a shifting line. But by the time you're kind of 8, 9, 10, you kind of got it. And yeah, I certainly wouldn't do what my parents did. I would have invited me into the process. I probably would. He died quite suddenly. He died of a kind of stroke on the drawbridge of Edinburgh Castle in a very cinematic death for him. And having survived the jungles of Burma, I think, and then come back and had a happy marriage and an unexpected child, I think it would have been perfect for him. So there was no kind of trajectory of illness for me to be kind of welcomed into. There was kind of hospital visits, but he wasn't in for any length of time, and there was no cancer diagnosis, which of course is quite common these days, and the way that which you can introduce children to the concept of impermanence and the fact that someone they love is going to die a lot more easy, I think, easier than if someone just drops dead, as my dad did.
Because what I think is wonderful is that you will often actually help the children be at the heart of the funeral. So you tell in your book a wonderful story about a boy whose mother had been reading to him but didn't finish the book, and I'll let you tell the rest of the story.
So his mother had a lovely, absolutely lovely family. The mother had developed multiple sclerosis, and the family were kind of coping with that. And she was kind of wheelchair bound, and she was really young. I think she was probably about 40, maybe a little bit older. And then she really cruelly developed sepsis, which kind of meant that she was beyond communicating and in a hospital bed all the time. And her son, who was probably about maybe 11 then, he would come in after school every day and he would talk to her, even though she could really only communicate through blinking by that stage. She was in the hospital like that for quite a long time as her condition painfully slowly deteriorated. And he would keep up a wonderful string of chatty stuff about what he'd done and what was going on at home. And then she became unconscious and she was put on a life support machine. And they made the decision between them that they needed to turn the machine off. So the son was reading to her. I can't remember what book it was, but he was reading to her as the life support machine was switched off. And when it came to her funeral, she was buried in a natural burial ground, he came up with the idea as an alternative to the Christian committal, because they weren't Christians, they were very much a punk family. He said, I didn't quite finish that book, and there were 4 pages to go. So his father, his sister, himself, and someone else lowered her down into the grave, and then he pulled up a chair and put it down and pulled out the book and read her the last 4 pages of the book. And when he'd finished it, he shut it, stood up, and him and his father and his sister filled the grave in. It was one of the most electrifying moments of my life, actually, and everyone around them. It was a smallish, there was probably about 30 people there, but it was a spine-tingling moment. It was truly extraordinary. And it wasn't anything we'd suggested. This is the beautiful thing about relinquishing the kind of traditional power roles that go in with being a funeral, capital F, director, capital D, in which you're the way everything comes from. It was entirely from him, and it was just perfect. It was absolutely extraordinary moment, incredible.
And I'm feeling quite emotional hearing you talk about it.
Yeah.
That is just so different from your experience, and in fact, probably the experience of many people when they go to funerals. I mean, like you, I was an adult by the time I went to a first funeral, although I had a grandfather and many great aunts that died. You know, the funerals were not places for children to go to.
They were not places for children, no. And part of that, I imagine, was for the convenience of the people doing the funeral. I'm not necessarily blaming the funeral directors or the vicar or whoever was in charge, but it was the perceived wisdom. It was part of the children. In this case, it was children should be neither heard nor seen at a funeral. But I did a funeral last week for a young man, 35, who had a brain tumour for over 10 years, which he didn't have an operation for the first 4 years and managed to keep the cancer at bay through diet and alternative treatment. And eventually it kind of progressed and he died during an operation. And his wife is very pregnant and they have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And we got them as involved as they possibly could be in the funeral. I think the children's grandfather had died a year or two previously, and the children didn't want to go anywhere near it. But we brought them in the night before to meet us and to see their dad's coffin, so it wasn't a shock. And on the day of the funeral, the little boy, the 3-year-old, had a marvellous bubble gun, and he was blowing soap bubbles at everyone who walked into the funeral. And when it came time to carry the dad out, the 6-year-old walked in front. She had a beautiful flower crown on. She walked in front with a little basket full of rose petals and scattered them in. And they were right sort of ringside, if I might say, for the burial. And then after the coffin was at the bottom of the grave, they completely spontaneously just sat with their legs hanging over the edge of the grave, looking down for about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour before we started to fill in. And then they were actively involved in the filling in of the grave. So I'm hoping that, while certainly for the 3-year-old will just have been an exciting day with lots of people around, will become something that with a pictorial record, they can place themselves absolutely in that moment and go, okay, yeah, I was present at my dad's funeral and I can hear those things that people were saying about him. It's really quite simple, Andrew, in so many ways. It's just about relinquishing total control and just not shepherding people down paths that are convenient or profitable, really. It's just about going, well, taking longer to get there. You know, sometimes we take up to a month if it's a delicate situation for people to kind of even wrap their heads around the fact that this person has died. So it's a gentle, slow process.
So how did you become an undertaker? Because you don't sound like...
No, you see, it's interesting because funeral directors and undertakers are, as all aspects of British society are, the kind of dark matter behind it all is, of course, class. Funeral directing is traditionally a working class trade, and there's an interesting kind of social mirror in that the vicars and the doctors who are kind of essential to it are usually middle class to upper middle class. And I describe myself as fallen posh, or post-posh, perhaps, really. You know, I have the posh name, Rupert. I have the accent. I have an extensive knowledge of John Donne, but I've got no money or any other kind of trappings. And really, I'm a bit of an anomaly. You know, I'm a middle-class vocational undertaker who's coming at it from an intellectual place rather than someone it's been handed down to. But the way it happened to me is that I recount in somewhat exposing detail in my book. I had been in boarding school from 7 to 17 when I was expelled. And then I inherited a whop of money, which I felt very guilty about because the rest of my family didn't really have it. and it had been frozen in a trust fund when my father died. He would have given it all to my mum, but it was frozen under Scottish law in my name. So I suddenly had a lot of money, had no idea what it was about, and really it sort of initiated a kind of slow motion nervous breakdown. And then my mother died when I was 25, and that kind of further pushed me into a dark place. But I was sitting watching television. I wasn't doing a lot then. The money meant that I didn't have to do a lot other than smoke a lot of hash and party and drink and try to kind of keep my nervous breakdown at bay. And I was watching television on a Monday afternoon, late Monday afternoon, and a programme came on with Janet Street Porter. You remember Janet Street Porter was a television...
Yeah, for people who don't know, she is a very colourful television presenter.
Yes, she is. Very, very, very assertive, very London. And rather strangely, she was head of the Ramblers Association at that time. So she had a programme on in which she'd go for lovely walks and she'd talk to interesting people along the way. And I just saw 5 minutes of it, and she was talking to this guy called Nicholas Albury, who was probably about 15 years older than me, sort of fellow public school dropout. He'd been immersed in the hippie culture and had created all sorts of extraordinary things, including squatted an enormous kind of block in Notting Hill and turned it into an independent republic called Frestonia, which was quietly indulged by the authorities, I think, the authorities at the time. But he had an experience. He had a child, and his wife, when they were pregnant, they decided to go off, live in the wilds for a bit. And his wife had a completely trouble-free, ecstatic home birth with just a midwife present in a cottage they'd rented in front of a roaring fire. And it was all absolutely lovely. Then a few months after that, his father died in a hospital at advanced age of an inevitable condition, with doctors fighting to save him as the way that doctors definitely still did then in hospitals. And it just struck him that why hadn't the hippies come in and colonised death the way that they had with birth and created the home birth movement? So he started a thing called the Natural Death Centre. And in doing this, managed to unpick that you didn't have to be buried in a cemetery, you could be buried anywhere within certain legal, environmental restrictions. But he also was talking about how you didn't need to use a funeral director, and that in fact a family could do everything themselves, and that you didn't need a license to be a funeral director or anything like that. And it was just an instantaneous transmission, I might even call it, a light bulb moment. I was just like, that's it. I'm going to be an undertaker. I'm going to be an undertaker, and I'm going to take all of my knowledge of death and bereavement, particularly how not to do it, and I'm going to apply it to the funerals I do. And we're not going to have a big shiny hearse, and I'm not going to use euphemisms, and I'm going to help with people in every single aspect of a funeral. So I went up the pub. I was like 27, 28. I went up the pub and went, hey, everyone, I'm going to be an undertaker. And, of course, they all laughed. But they're not laughing now, mainly because I think I buried about 6 of them. But it took a while to convince people that this actually was my vocation. And it burned so fiercely inside of me that I just knew I was going to do it. I didn't realise that it was quite a difficult industry to break into. I just kind of read books on death, went and saw my first dead body and didn't faint. So I thought, okay, that's good. Did as much publicity as I could, and the phone rang and I had a funeral and I was off.
So, I mean, the shocking thing is that anybody can do it and you don't need any special training.
No, I mean, and this is a shocking thing. And, you know, the funeral industry...
I should say this is in the UK.
Oh, yeah, this is in the UK. I mean, in Germany, I have an English friend who's an undertaker in Germany, and the rules are much more restrictive and much more traditional in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, my first partner unfortunately died when I was 37, and he died in Germany. And I wanted the ashes to be sent to me in the UK so that we could scatter them where he wanted, which was on Beachy Head. And what I discovered was in Germany, the only person who can scatter ashes is a professional undertaker. It's a health risk otherwise. Yeah. I mean, fortunately, they decided that because I lived in the UK, that they could post them to me. If I'd lived in Germany,
Yeah,
I wouldn't. So I think we need to just stipulate this is only
absolutely.
in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, the restrictions around ashes in Germany are quite intense. And I can't see how, I mean, flagging them up as a health hazard is absolutely crazy. But no, the UK, weirdly, is the kind of opposite of Germany in that sense. You don't need a funeral director. It's not a kind of professional qualification. It kind of quite seamlessly morphed from the sort of village amateur, the carpenter, and who would make your box and collect your dead. It just kind of went like that. There was no point where someone went, we need to professionalise this. And there is a lot of talk in the UK, and there has been for many, many years, about regulation. And I can see people's point, really. I mean, my kind of answer is how I'm not regulated. I'm not a member of any trade organisation because I always feel that's a bit disingenuous. I think people who belong to a trade organisation, it doesn't reassure the public, or it might reassure the public, but it shouldn't, because a trade organisation is there to protect its member when disputes come up. So I'm not a member of anything. My point is the buck stops with me. If anything goes wrong, there's only two of us. There's always ever been two of us. We might have occasionally got someone in to help with the paperwork, but there is, if you've got a complaint or if something goes wrong, it's so obvious who's done it. And that would be my argument as to why I shouldn't be regulated. Also, I just think it would be a shame that if regulation comes in, it would stop those small number of people who do it themselves, who do all of it themselves. And I advise people on the phone as to how to do it. And it's incredibly straightforward, though it does require an enormous amount of chutzpah to go, I'm going to go to the hospital mortuary and collect my dead friend or my dead mum. To do all of that requires a lot of steel. But I think if you overregulate too much and you put a funeral director in the middle of every interaction with death, then something huge would be lost there, really.
So how did you feel when you had, for the very first time, a body that was your responsibility?
I felt very, very responsible. I mean, the first funeral I did was quite complicated in the sense that we didn't collect his body until the day of the funeral. I didn't have a car at that stage, so I had to hire my pub landlord, who had the biggest estate car that I knew of.
I had a picture for a moment of you going on the bus with it.
It was, if necessary. But so the first time I actually touched my first dead body was in the presence of his family, was in the hospital mortuary with the help of the mortuary technicians. We got his body out and we shaved him. I'd never shaved anyone other than myself, so to suddenly be shaving someone else who was dead was a bit of a learning curve, and dressed him with the help of his wife and his daughter. And it was an extraordinary experience. And all I had to kind of do was just sort of radiate a certain amount of calm authority, as it were, just so that this was sad and difficult, but incredibly meaningful for us all to be doing. It was an extraordinary moment. But as I describe in the book, I got my bluff called quite early on with this job, because I did a few funerals and I was like, got it, okay. It's late middle-aged men who don't look after their diet. It's little old ladies living on their own. The first three were as I expected. But the fourth one was very traumatic, and that kind of initiated me, I feel, into the whole business.
So you didn't feel out of your depth?
Oh, completely out of my depth. It was an enormously complicated funeral. Having dressed him and shaved him and got him into his cardboard coffin, we then drove to a church. He was a postman, the first man I buried. He was a postman, and we went to the church, and the church was absolutely full of postmen in their uniform. And all I knew about funerals was what I'd read in the Natural Death Handbook, which was very much participatory. And so this very early cardboard coffin didn't have any handles, didn't have any rope handles. So the way we carried it was I went and cut 3 sort of kind of 4.5, 5 foot long hazel staves. And the idea was that we'd bear him in with 6 people, sort of a little bit like a sort of Cleopatra kind of coming in, which sounded great until we got to the church door and I realised that I'd cut them a little bit too wide for the church door. So, but they weren't fixed, so they just had to kind of pivot. So we kind of entered the church a little bit like a cautious caterpillar. And then, of course, we placed him down on the altar steps, and he slightly started to roll because they were round stayed. The whole thing was an absolute terror, to be honest, Andrew. And then his best friend stood up in the church after the vicar had done a bit and said, Barry didn't believe in all this crap. And I was absolutely horrified. I was like, we didn't have to do it in a church. He was being buried in his friend's garden after the service. So the vicar was understandably annoyed at that. So it slightly turned into a kind of atheist Christian pulpit battle, which just added to my nerves, to be honest. And then we had to take him out and caterpillar him through the door again and get him in the boot of my pub landlord's car and drive to the friend's garden where it was lashing with rain and carry him and lower him into his grave. The whole thing was exhilarating but psychedelically stressful. It really, I couldn't... The margin for error was tiny. It always is in a funeral. You just have to kind of forget one little thing, as everybody does in a job, one little thing with a funeral, and you've kind of destroyed the moment for people. And it's easy to forget something obvious. So yeah, I do. After that first funeral, I really did think I've landed. I can do this. But yeah, it was then realizing that not every funeral was going to be a bloke who'd had a heart attack because he didn't believe that white bread was bad for you, or a little old lady aged 80 who died of pancreatic cancer. It was going to be more unexpected.
And the problem is, every time you step out of the predestined, we know it works funeral, you end up falling down holes. So my partner was in his early 40s when he died. This was all happening in Germany, in German, so you can imagine the complexity of it for me.
Yeah.
But I was told by a friend of his who was a German equivalent of a vicar and who was going to conduct the service, that at the end at the crematorium, they had a system where the coffin went down into the basement. And the problem was because it was very old equipment, it made all sorts of weird creaking noises and was not very dignified.
No.
And the thought of somebody going down, with our Christian imagery is not a particularly good one. So what we decided is that he said, what we'll do is we'll have a pile of candles and a tray of sand, and as each person goes out, they light a candle and they disappear that way. And so everybody leaves and the coffin stays there and we can do the business afterwards. And I thought, fine, wonderful. What I didn't realise is, obviously, as the principal mourner, I was the first person to light a candle, and then I was out in the corridor. And then next came my partner's mother and father, who, as you can imagine, were elderly, and his mother was in a wheelchair. So this whole process took a very long time. So I was left in the corridor for about 5 minutes, or at least it felt like 5 minutes, all on my own, which felt, in a way, a symbolism of my life at that moment. But I didn't need it. But when you have a traditional funeral, it all flows because there's nothing can go wrong because it's been copper-bottomed 10 million times over.
Yeah.
And this is the problem. Every time you step outside, you have these problems.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm so sorry about that, Andrew. I mean, I'm just thinking about it. What I would have done if I was conducting your partner's funeral is I would have got you to light the candles at the beginning, and they would burn throughout the ceremony, and then got people to snuff them out as they left. And I would have got you to be the last person there. I think as the principal mourner, the idea of you going first and then going out to the corridor while everyone else does that. It's a little thing, but it's a huge thing. And I think that would have hopefully made a difference. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so often I just think, why have I made this rod for my back of having to completely reinvent everything every time? Why don't we just go, here's the, burial or cremation, fine. Okay, 45-minute slot or half an hour, 3 songs, one when you come in, one in the middle, one when you go out. a couple of people speaking, bit of naff poetry, all that kind of stuff, it would be so much easier. Brochure, just going, right, look at, here's the flowers. Would you like a spray like that? But because every time we basically go, they have to be buried or cremated. But how we get there, as long as it's legal, we can do it. And, your imagination is the only barrier to this. But a lot of times I go, just wish it would be so. I see my sort of traditional competitors at the crematorium, and they have the professional bearers who are retired, quite often retired policemen because they're a bit, unflappable, all the same height, all wearing fairly cheap suits, looking very solemn. The hearse looks absolutely immaculate. They carry the coffin in, whoever's doing the services in there, they come out, that's it. They kind of go and have a fag round the back, and they might do 2 or 3 of those. Some of the funeral directors who live close to the crematorium, they might do 3 of those in the day. 2 will be with the service, 1 will be, a sort of formal direct cremation. And I look at them and go, wow, yeah, they're financially, they're much more successful, but it is a conveyor belt.
So what's the cumulative effect on you? I wonder, because, most of us visit the land of death from time to time, but, you're a resident there.
It varies. It kind of goes in, it's a bit like a sine wave, I suppose. And I go through moments of just going, I can't do this anymore. I can't deal with this unrelenting march of grief. So, what would be described as burnout. And I also have gone through what would be described as compassion fatigue, where you just go, I just can't find myself caring as much as I did in the previous 15, 20 years. But those kind of go, and then I find myself so energized by it, so energized by the people I meet and their ordinary people's capacity for just enormous love. It is enormous love and courage. It's so humbling. But the book opens with me making a crop circle, which I kind of ringed my town over a period of 3 years with. I think I did about 18 or something like that. And I started off just doing them for fun, as it were, but then they evolved into rituals. I would go in and try and deliberately shake off the accumulation of grief, because it kind of goes in the deaths. Sometimes we can have a run of very expected, normal, in the right order deaths, and then a run of terribly, terribly tragic young people in accidents, young, drug misadventures, what I would call suicide by neglect, which I think a lot of men do. And I've been, at times I've been dangerously close to myself. I think us men, quite often when things aren't going great, we just stop looking after ourselves. And bearing men of my kind of comparable age, my comparable culture and mindset, who have just stopped caring for themselves to the point where they die. That's really, really quite hard to take. But I fall in love with families, and not every family by any means, but I fall in love with some families. They're just fabulous, and you form such an intense relationship with them for a kind of, maybe up to a month, that it completely invigorates you. And the littlest things you do are transformative for their experience of their bereavement. So it's kind of living for those moments. And I'm not going to lie, Andrew, in the past 25 years, at times I've used unhealthy coping mechanisms. I've drunk too much and absented myself through dope in the early days. That's definitely been a danger. But I have a therapist from time to time. I have friends I can kind of talk to about it. And I kind of just try to feel it, let it in, and then let it out again.
And I've got a question to ask you that's slightly personal, but here goes. My father died in England while I now lived in Germany, and it all happened during COVID as well, which made things more difficult. But we were able to have it wasn't one of those periods where you couldn't have a proper funeral.
No.
But there was quite a wait because the crematorium was backed up a little bit. So I think it was like 4 or 5 weeks between the death and the funeral.
Yeah.
And I sort of thought, well, I'd like to see the body. And the industrialized undertakers that my father wanted to use, because they'd done my mother's funeral,
Of course. Yeah.
suggested very firmly not. And so I just sat with the coffin rather than actually saw the body. And I'm wondering, what would it have been like to see a body after that length of time? Because our imagination runs riot. And is it a good idea to see a body towards the end of the process before they go in the ground or not? Or is it not a good idea? I mean, it's not a question you can ask anybody else beyond you. So
No, absolutely.
I thought I would ask the question.
Well, the American poet and undertaker Thomas Lynch describes, he says, people often say to him, and they often say to me, I don't want to see them because I want to remember them as they were. And he says, yeah, I totally understand, but remembering them as they were starts with accepting them as they are. And of course, this is in America where everybody's pretty much embalmed as a matter of course, and funerals involve people filing past the open coffin to pay their respects, and they look fab. And I don't do that, and I imagine your industrialized undertakers didn't either.
No.
So I would never, ever stop anybody, particularly someone like yourself. I do a lot of funerals for people who've died, and their children and family live all over the globe. And it might take 4 or 5 weeks because people can only get over here in that time frame. And I often get asked about that. So what I will do is I will go, okay, their body is starting to go. They're in this condition. Their eyes might be quite sunken in. Their cheeks might be quite sunken in. Do you still really want to see them? And I would never, ever stand in the way of someone who really goes, no, I understand that. I need to see them because it's a very, very strong urge to see somebody's body. And I once negotiated between a woman, I never met her, she rang me up, and her mother had died, and I think she'd lain undiscovered for a good few days, and her body had started to decay quite drastically. And she wanted to see her, and the undertaker was absolutely not. And the woman rang me up going, can you help kind of negotiate between us? And I did. And the undertaker was doing it from a well-meaning place, but he was of the old school mindset that couldn't quite countenance the idea that someone might see this advanced decay and be all right with it, or not, if not all right with it, have a stronger need to see that person than their revulsion of what they had become. So we negotiated back and forth, and it's as you say, for her imagination was running wild.
Yeah, I had sort of worms in them and sort of that sort of idea.
Of course, absolutely. That's an understandable image. Part of that is horror films and horror culture, but also part of it is true, So I'm sure that wouldn't have been the case with your father. Did he die of old age or cancer? I mean,
it was about 10 things on the death certificate.
Right.
I mean, he was 91, so it was a sort of a fight to see what got him first, sort of kind of thing.
Yes.
But it happened all of a sudden, people, it's a bit like going bankrupt. You go bankrupt slowly and then all of a sudden. And I think it's a bit like that with death sometimes as well.
Nice analogy. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I totally get that. Well, I would not have kept you out from seeing your father. People have seen bodies I had one woman whose husband died, and the funeral was quite a way in the future, and they absolutely adored each other, this couple. And she came in and sat beside him for a long time, every day, for a good couple of weeks, and his body started to kind of slowly decay in front of her. And it was a sort of very slow process. It wasn't what a friend of mine calls wet death, which is a sort of, viscerally visual idea of what people think death is about. It wasn't like that. But his features were kind of changing more and more. The nose is something, the kind of cartilage on the nose gets kind of wizened, and you really can see that somebody is properly dead. She came and sat and talked to him and meditated on his body for days and days and days. It was, and I kept on thinking, maybe at this point she'll go, I don't want to do it. But she absolutely needed to do it and bear witness to him. She loved him. I'm friends with her now. I see her. I haven't asked her. It's now probably about 15 years later. I haven't asked her and gone, did that override your memory of your long life together? And I'm really hoping it didn't. And she hasn't ever suggested to me that it did, and that she was that she would do anything differently. But it's a proprietorial, slightly patriarchal approach, which the funeral industry still has as a kind of general mindset to protect you, you know.
Well, all I can say is good on that lady for bearing witness, and good on you for facilitating it.
Thank you.
So we're going to take a break. I think I need one. And then we're going to come back with a letter.
Great.
The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material and other benefits.
This is a really hard letter to write, and I've put off doing so many times. I'm a guy in my late 20s, I have a well-paid job, good friends, and on paper everything should be fine, but it's not. Life is a daily struggle to push on through the fog. It feels like I'm carrying a backpack full of stones. I've looked at my symptoms on the internet and I guess I'm suffering from depression, but I have not spoken to my doctor or anybody about it, so I don't know for sure. Why haven't I sought out help? To be honest, I don't know. But it seems like too much hassle to fight with the receptionist to get an appointment, and what is a doctor going to do in the 10 minutes or so I have allocated? And anyway, I have enough trouble turning up at work and doing an imitation of a responsible member of staff when I'm barely functioning. I do all sorts of crazy things to cope, like distracting myself with stupid YouTube videos, drinking too much, or watching porn. I tell myself that if I just take it really easy at the weekend, go to bed at a sensible time, I will catch up with my sleep and feel refreshed again on Monday morning. But I stay up late watching shit and turn up at work exhausted. I don't think I have enough energy to keep fighting, but if I can't find enough to make a start, what do I do? So, Ru, can you empathise with this letter?
I can completely empathise with that letter, absolutely. I really feel for him, and I think that it's an understandable response to our times, really. And, you know, he's obviously kind of playing with addictions, as a lot of us do. I mean, you know, I'm diagnosed with ADHD and I have a dopamine deficiency, and I can scroll through nonsense for hours. So I really sympathise with his struggle with addictions. It strikes me there that, you know, Gabor Mate, the marvellous doctor and addiction expert, says that the opposite of addiction is connection. So it just feels like, you know, your 20s can be quite a lonely and bewildering time. So it can look like your peers are having the time of their lives and you're not. You've got kind of friends around you, but it's not quite enough. It just sounds like I think he needs to stop beating himself up. And clearly the job that he's doing isn't moving and satisfying enough to give him a real sense of comfort, which sadly is the case for, I don't know what percentage of people who do jobs that really aren't. They're just kind of, they're doing the job to earn the money, to live in the house, to travel to the job, you know, one of those kind of cycles. Not everyone can find a vocation. It's almost a bit of a luxury. But I hear a lot of...
I think the word is quiet desperation.
Quiet desperation, absolutely. And I think the state of the world we're living in, the state of ongoing climate collapse is, I mean, he sounds like his symptoms are fairly mild, to be honest. I just, there's a part of me in there which just went, all the things, the distractions he's using, the addictions he's using, there's no joy in there. And it's really, really difficult to say to people, go out and find joy when our news feeds are filled with the horrors of Gaza and the Middle East and unbelievably painful truths about what's going to happen to our climate. But, I think Snoopy, Peanuts, the comic strip Peanuts, which I think is really, there's not much you can't learn from Snoopy, Asterix and Tintin. But, Snoopy's defiant, joyful dancing on his doghouse for no reason, which would infuriate Lucy Van Pelt. I think we all need to try and do that occasionally, but it's difficult. I think people mix up the joyful with the damaging, like porn and alcohol and just mindless scrolling. You need to find some simple joy. I mean, I worry that I'm lowering my IQ with this, but I do find cat videos on the internet mind-blowingly funny, and I can set myself off and feel this, just feel it's like turning a motor on of just silly, carefree laughter, joyous laughter. And I think that's what people need to kind of cling on to there, is just do something that's not damaging or makes you feel bad about yourself, but that's simple joy. But maybe it's easier to say than to do, isn't it?
I have to say that you have made the first step. Writing to us is actually putting a marker down and saying, I have a problem. And I agree with you entirely, Rue, that don't beat yourself up about it. This is the problem of our times, that we are sold many fake solutions. And what you need to find is authentic solutions. And the authentic solutions come from you. Now, it might be good to see your doctor, because one of the things he can do is he can write you off sick for a while, because it could be a week off will actually allow you to see the wood from the trees, so to speak, so that you've actually got enough time to actually find the energy to do something constructive. So I think it's worth doing the battle to get a week off. That will not be the answer. Don't think that the week off and you're going to go back to work and it's all going to be fine, but it's going to give you enough of a breathing space to think, what is it that I do need? Do you need a therapist, somebody who's actually going to listen to you? Is it unresolved trauma? If you want a book to read on trauma, I'm going to stay with Gabor Mate. I usually recommend The Myth of Normal, which is going to normalize all the stuff that you're talking about, because there could be something very profound that needs to be heard, or it might be something less profound, but that equally needs to be heard. The depression is trying to tell you something, and nearly always depression is about suppression. You're trying to avoid some painful feelings, but actually shutting yourself off isn't going to be the solution. But I think do speak to your doctor. You could consider medication, but I think the most important thing would be a break. Maybe if you work in a large enough organization, speak to human resources. It's perfectly possible that they will know about depression and burnout and will be empathetic to it. You might find some allies. I hope you feel you've had a couple of allies that have normalized it and said, it's okay. Everybody else is feeling the same way. There's just, they're just better at hiding it, to be perfectly honest.
You're a wise man, Andrew. I completely agree with you there. And particularly, I think if the writer of the letter is listening and you're in the UK, absolutely, I would go and fight to see your GP. And as Andrew says, get a week off, because I have a horrible feeling that the way that the health service and the government are going, that won't be an option forever. I mean, at the moment, they're thinking of withdrawing welfare benefits for people diagnosed with serious mental illness, which just strikes me as an incredible national wounding. So get in while you can and get a week off, because you deserve it. It's okay to have a week off, even if you don't do much other than read the marvellous Gabor Mate.
Yeah, that would be an act of love to yourself to read that book. To be honest, I'm pretty certain it's available on an audiobook, so you don't even have to read it. You just need to lie there in a darkened room and listen to him.
Absolutely, yes. Gabor. But the thing that's so brilliant about Gabor Mate is his first book about addictions. Is that
yes.
The Realm of the Hungry Ghosts?
Yeah.
The wonderful thing about that is you read that book And you kind of go, okay, this guy's absolutely brilliant. He's doing amazing work. And then he starts to reveal himself more and more. And his addictions are, he goes, you might think these aren't addictions. I'm not going out and smoking crack. And, I've got an addiction to buying CDs, classical CDs. And it sounds ridiculous at first. But as you kind of get it, as he reveals more and more about himself, you just go, well, this guy is exactly the same as any of us who struggle with addiction.
And you'll find that his childhood was absolutely steeped with trauma from beginning to end. So,
yeah.
And the lengths he went to avoid it is also extraordinary. So it's a very compelling read.
Yeah.
So we are beginning to run out of time. We are going to be doing some bonus material where I'm going to be talking to Ru about how to create a ritual, because rituals are a very good way of getting through difficult times. But how do you actually put one together? You heard a little bit about in the program about how a good ritual can be healing, and a ritual that's sort of half off actually can compound the problem. So we're going to be talking about creating a ritual. But before we finish, I need to ask you as a witness on The Meaningful Life, what makes your life meaningful?
My work, even though it's not, I'm not an entrepreneur. It's not that I thought maybe I might have been years ago, but I'm not. I'm quite scatty. My ADHD is quite overwhelming, and I've managed to kind of weaponize my trauma. Not weaponize, that's an unfortunate word. Harness. Thank you, Andrew. I've managed to harness my trauma to be able to visibly help people, and it gives me extraordinary meaning. But of course also friends and family. But I'm 54 now, and when you're in your 20s, you have hundreds and hundreds of friends, and you think it's going to be like that forever, and you think every friendship is going to last forever, and you're all going to grow old together and die. And of course that doesn't happen. Circumstance, you move around the country or move countries, you just drift apart from people, and you're kind of left with, in your 50s, with a sort of very small group of hopefully very good friends, which is what I found myself with now. I should say you only need 5 people that are not your family that you can tell anything to, and everybody else is welcome. But you just need that kind of core of people, and I've got that, and I've got a job which, even though from time to time I feel the existential weight of it, there's never a moment when I don't go, this job isn't worth it. This job isn't worthwhile. I'm doing a good thing. It's healing me, and I'm healing other people. So definitely my work.
Well, I've got many more questions that I want to ask Ru, and I'm going to. And if you want to join us, you can hear the bonus material by subscribing directly via Apple or Spotify. And if you want to become a supporter of The Meaningful Life and unlock the bonus material that way, here are the details.
You've been listening to The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. You can follow Andrew on Twitter, like him on Facebook, and please leave a review wherever you consume your podcasts. Making, editing, and distributing The Meaningful Life comes with substantial costs, and we'd like to ask for your help. Visit our website, andrewgmarshall.com/podcast, where you can join our supporters club and unlock bonus material for every program, send in a letter to be discussed by Andrew and his guests, and join a community of other people seeking to make their life meaningful. At the gold level, you get even more benefits. Production of The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall is by Michael Dooney. Social media by Madeleine Healy. Sound engineering and theme tune by Sebastian de la Luz Mendoza. And I'm Susie Colick. Please tell your friends and spread the word. Thank you.